That's right. Your favorite sword's going up on the chopping block, and there's nothing you can do about it. I'm going to talk about the Greatsword, and I'm going to talk a lot of shit. I'm going to talk a lot of shit about the Greatsword. I'm going to talk a lot of shit about people who like the Greatsword. I'm going to talk a lot of shit about the concept of oversized weapons in general. And I'm going to do all of this with the love and appreciation that every large sword deserves. Because secretly, like everybody who hates something, I'm really a fan. Everybody loves great swords. Everybody loves it because there's something about a big, heavy, thick, sweaty sword that just gets every man going. And if you're wondering why I feel the need to do this, the answer is quite simple. There's a problem in the HEMA community, and that problem is that people are substituting one inanimate object for another inanimate object. And they're doing so in a way that is ahistorical, bad research, bad fencing, bad athletics, bad everything. Basically, every single one of the letters of HEMA, and then kind of ruined, I guess, except European. What I need people to understand here is that when you go to the sources and you go to the texts and you find something that inspires you, that makes you feel strong and powerful and alive, it's probably a lie, because there's nothing fantastical about sword fighting. There's nothing particularly interesting about oversized swords. There's nothing really deeply special about a sword fighter, even during a time when skill at sword fighting was at a premium. The reality here is that there's nothing that's going to save you from some peasant running up behind you and shanking you in the ass, just like there's nothing saving you from that today. And like one of my previous videos where I talk about power fantasies and self-defense, what I think the Greatsword is and what it means to people now is exactly what it meant to people back then. Namely, that it's a power fantasy, a self-defense power fantasy. The idea that if I just have a weapon that's big enough and thick enough and good enough at keeping men at a safe distance from me, I won't be able to be accosted in the street. Or if I hire somebody that looks like that and fits that description, well, then all the better. Now, I wouldn't be a very good HEMAist if I didn't go to the sources. And when discussing the sources on Greatsword, there are a couple of really good options and there are a couple of really bad options. And the one that I found to be the best was Marozzo. The reason I thought his was the best was it was the most detailed, it was the longest, it had the most actual substance when it came to discussing plays and guards in a classic, Renaissance Italian style. Even the pictures were pretty good. But the problem with reading Marozzo's Greatsword is that it became abundantly clear that it was just longsword. It was longsword, but a little bit bigger. And there are some seriously important changes that Marozzo makes when discussing how to use the Greatsword effectively as a slightly longer longsword. But what is notably missing are all of the power fantasy elements. You can take down 4 people at once. This is how you take out a pike block. All this stuff about being a bodyguard, it's all missing. And instead, what we have is a very down-to-earth, very practical use case of it's just a longsword, but bigger. But one thing I want to make very clear is the date. Marozzo's text was published in around 1558, the middle of the 1500s. And this is important to take mind of because all of the stories about Landsknechts and their abilities to take out pike blocks originates generally from the mid-1400s to, at best, the mid-1500s. But usually you see it being like maybe the early 1400s into right about the turn of the century. And that creates a little bit of a problem because it means that, as far as I can tell, Marozzo's published date beats the last known use of the Landsknecht soldier by about 30 years, which doesn't seem like a lot when you're dealing with, years in the hundreds, but it is a really long time. I'm only 32, which means that I wouldn't have been born in the time that Landsknechts would have still been doing their thing. So it feels a little odd for Marozzo to have made a Greatsword treatise when, as far as anyone can tell, use of the Greatsword in pike blocks seems to have started to dissipate or outright disappear. And the answer to why it's in there, in my opinion, comes from an understanding of what's called the Fectschule. the fight school. Now, what you have to understand is that in the 1400s, there were these big, heavy knights in shining armor taking their big, heavy cavalry and their armored horses and just smashing infantry, doing all kinds of crazy, cool, heroic things that made them the stuff of legend. And those legends were just as popular in the mid 1500s as they were back when they were happening. And the problem here is that the fectula was primarily a method of demonstration as much as it was a school for learning how to fight. And what that means is that if you lived in a 1500s town, there was probably a fight school in your area that would do demonstrations, on feast days and stuff like that, where all the cool people would come out and they'd start swinging their swords around and looking like badasses. So the reason that the greatsword and the longsword would be appearing here suddenly starts to make a little bit more sense. These people had just as much of an idolatry problem with the 100 years of the past, and they wanted to recreate those forms and those heroic deeds by basically doing cool things in the town square, which suddenly makes the greatsword treatise feel a little bit different. Maybe at the end of the day, the real reason that anyone made a longsword treatise past the year 1500 was the same reason they made a greatsword treatise, namely that they wanted to feel like a really cool Lands Connect badass, but there weren't any around anymore, so no one was there to tell them they were wrong, and more importantly, they weren't ever actually using these things in warfare anymore, so you could kind of just go out and freeball it a little bit, and no one would be the wiser. So this already starts to burst the bubble of, the whole bodyguard weapon idolatry idea, but it also props up the idea, which I'm going to touch on more later, which is that is really what the greatsword and in a lot of ways the longsword embodies. It's a reference to a time that used to be that no longer is. And there's a deep irony in that a lot of people will call some of the fencing masters from this time period the first HEMAists, because they are in a lot of ways the first people trying to recreate a dead art, an art that is dead to them only a couple dozen generations after it happened, whereas we're trying to recreate it several hundred years after it happened. But the problems still remain, and the problems are the same. But what that means is that when we look at sources, we have to be very specific about understanding the cultural context that they came from, because otherwise we're going to end up falling for the same kind of demonstrative, flourishy, cool guy bullshit that people might still fall for today as they did 250 years ago. So you might be wondering now, what about the other sources? Well, there are a couple other that go over greatsword, but the problem is that they are not very consistent in how much information they actually delve out. There are some other sources like the Destreza type sources, and there's Godino. But what I found was that when I was looking at other sources for greatsword, they were all either extremely short sections in other larger works, or just flat out utter nonsense. And what I found very ironic was that every single time I found an instance of somebody or a historical source playing up the abilities of the greatsword for multi-person fighting, they were always these shorter, smaller segments. And the only time I really saw a play where it was a bodyguard style situation was when there was a play where you were supposed to grab the belt of the person with the greatsword while they kind of spun around like a Beyblade, and they would theoretically protect you so that you could run away. And at no point did that ever really make any sense, but more importantly, that it was not expounded upon in any way. It wasn't even in a section that had a lot to do with the greatsword in general. So I really can't help but point out that whenever someone tries to tell me that there's this evidence that the greatsword was used in this particular way, I can't help but point out that it all seems extremely flimsy, directly contradicted by other better, more detailed sources, and most importantly, just seems like a tall tale or a stupid little story you'd tell kids to make them think Lands Connects were really cool. And what we get here is a problem that is deeply rooted in the HEMA community, especially the early HEMA community, where people would find a source that essentially told them what they already wanted to hear and then latched onto it so hard that if you ever told them that whatever they were repeating didn't really seem like it would work, they'd tell you that you were taking the H out of HEMA, you were ignoring history, and you were ignoring sources. But of course, as you might expect, that's not actually how this works. if you want to actually be a good historian, you have to be able to play historical sources off of each other. You have to compare their contexts. You have to be able to talk about the ways in which they might be wrong or lying or truthful or completely ahistorical. You have to be able to look at a source and understand that it's not 100% verified truth. And that creates a lot of really serious problems with people, especially forum and keyboard warriors who just want to be able to stand on the shoulders of actual researchers, say, well, it's in the book, that means it's real, and then use that to prop up their own power fantasies. It's not good HEMA, it's not good research, and yet it still proliferates to this day because it allows people to give themselves the sense of self-worth that they want from a power fantasy without having to actually engage with the act of, trying it out. So if we're going to take down the Greatsword, the first thing we need to do is define it. And this is where we run into our first little problem. You see, Greatsword is a completely modern word, and it doesn't really mean anything. Going back into history, all kinds of different cultures and peoples and places had different words for different tools that they used. And while we might categorize a few of them into the general category of Greatsword, there is no consistent measurements that any one of these things, even if you use their official names, ever actually had. You see, go for something like the Zweihander, a very common thing that people on the internet will talk about as being a kind of Greatsword. And it is. But the problem is that it doesn't really have any qualifying qualities. Sometimes it's the Flambeurs, that thing with the little snaky S sword. Or sometimes it's these big ring guard things that Doppelsoldners would use, or whatever the fuck a Doppelsoldner is. And Lance Connects too sometimes get thrown into the picture. And nobody really knows which way is up because, of course, in reality, history has no connection or consistency. The reality is that there was no industrialization at this time, which means that every single sword or greatsword that was ever made was made to the specifications and qualities demanded by the person who was paying for it. While there were certain instances of people mass producing weapons and then giving them out, the reality is that most of the time, if not almost all of the time, a soldier, even a mercenary, was pretty much expected to have their own gear, their own sword, and based on the things that they brought with them, they were kind of assigned roles that way. If you had a horse and a lance, you were put into the category of people who used those things. And if you wore fancy clothes and a fancy colorful hat and brought a big two-handed sword, well, they'll find something for you to do, I'm sure. But the reality here is that there's not a lot of consistency and a lot written down about what makes a greatsword a greatsword. So I'm going to attempt to define it in a way not that has specifics, but has relations. Let me put it this way. What is the difference between a sword and a longsword? Well, the longsword is longer. So what's the difference between a longsword and a greatsword? The greatsword's greater. It's bigger in every dimension, to the point where, and at least in my opinion, what separates the greatsword from the longsword is that it can't be worn on your hip. A sword is something that you carry around. It's very convenient. It's light, generally used in one hand. A longsword is longer, and it has a longer grip. And it's just at the point where you can barely walk around with it, but it's kind of inconvenient. But what you get in inconvenience, you also get in extra length, and you can put two hands on it, which means you can do a little bit more damage and, mess a few people up. The greatsword, then, is the one that's a little bit longer, a little bit wider, a little bit heavier, and most importantly, increased in all of those degrees to the point where you can't wear it on your hip at all. You have to carry it around like a pole arm. And that's going to be a key difference here, because in my opinion, what makes a greatsword is that inconvenience. It is that show that it puts on. The fact that you can look at a greatsword and know exactly what it is just by looking at it. Because what makes a greatsword is its intimidating presence. Its desired goal in the person who bought it and the person who manufactured it to strike fear into the hearts of anyone who gazes upon it. Much like a giant pickaxe will strike fear into the hearts of small rocks, a greatsword is meant to strike fear into the hearts of anyone who is vulnerable to its attacks, which is, of course, more people than are vulnerable to a longsword or a regular sword. So we're going to get now into the meat of the argument, and that is the design goals of the Greatsword. But to talk about this, we have to talk about how people design swords. It's 100% true that you can look at any weapon, medieval or otherwise most of the time, and tell exactly, based on the design goals, what its intended use was. With medieval weapons, this is even easier. Think about a mace. A mace is a big, heavy metal stick with an even bigger, heavy metal ball at the end of it. Why? Because when you put the weight of an object at the end of a stick and you swing it around, it creates a lot more force. Force equal to the amount of weight that's sitting at the end of it. If you try to make the stick part of the mace heavier, you don't really get anything out of it. But if you make the mace part of the mace heavier, it gets a whole lot more effective. Therefore, when you go and you look at period accurate maces, you think about, oh, that mace is only 4 pounds. Who cares? But it's 4 pounds concentrated into the end of a stick. That does a lot more than, say, 4 pounds of metal stretched over the entire length of a sword. Therefore, even though a one-handed arming sword might be just as heavy as a mace, they're not going to hit as hard as each other. The mace has the design goal of delivering maximum force per weight, whereas the sword's job is to kind of thin out, widen out, and broaden out so that it can cut really well. So if we talk about, say, pole arms, we talk about the exact same thing as the mace. So the first issue that I have with the Greatsword, and probably the biggest one possible, is that we don't see the same design goals that we see in pole arms, despite the fact that you have made something that is essentially the length of a pole arm. In what planet is the Greatsword better at swinging than a pole arm of equivalent size and equivalent weight? You see, because a Greatsword has to be like 6, 7, 8 pounds, which isn't a lot, but it's 8 pounds that's strung out all the way over the full length of your blade. Whereas a poleaxe might be 8 pounds, but all of that 8 pounds is all the way up at the top, meaning that when you swing it, you're getting 8 pounds of force. But if you swing a Greatsword, you're not getting 8 pounds anymore. You're getting more like 4 or 5. And even worse, the reason you have to choke up on a polearm is because the further up you go, the easier it is to swing around that 8 pounds. And yet at the same time, swinging around a Greatsword by just its grip with your arms maybe only this far apart is also really, really hard. So hard that every single two-handed Greatsword that you see has this little thing right above the ring guards that allows you to put your hand there so that you can swing it like a polearm. But if you're swinging it like a polearm, why not use a polearm? The polearm is going to do the job of the polearm far better than the Greatsword is. So there must be some kind of use case where having that much blade is advantageous. If we want to talk about Greatswords, what we have to talk about now is its specific design goals. And what I want to talk about specifically is the Zweihander, because it's what I think most people think of when they think of Greatswords, and it has a lot of very interesting design goals to talk about. First being the fact that it has a really, really long blade. Now, why do you want a long blade in a weapon? The longer something is, the more a reach advantage you might have over your opponent. If I have a Greatsword and you have a tiny little dagger, and then we both try to stab each other, it's pretty obvious which one of us is going to have the advantage. The more length I have over my opponent, for the purposes of stabbing and cutting for the most part, I'm going to be able to hit you from a distance where you can't hit me. And as long as I stay at that distance, I have a very clear advantage where you have to be walking forward, you have to be trying to parry me, you have to be trying to get past my weapon. Meanwhile, I can just swing at you knowing that you're not going to be able to hit me at the same time, more or less. Now, it's 100% true that regular swords tend to have really short grips. Grips that are basically as long as your one hand. Why? Because you only want to use it in one hand. Long swords have grips that are a little bit longer, long enough for two hands to fit. But the Greatsword is significantly longer than even the longsword's grip. And the question becomes why? I'm still only using it in two hands. What does having a longer grip get me? And the answer is, when we look at polearms and other weapons like that, a longer grip allows you to apply more efficient leverage to the object. More efficient leverage is going to be needed because the weapon is going to be so much heavier. The reality, though, is that the heavier your sword is, the harder it is to move. And the harder it is to move, regardless of how strong you are, the slower it is to move. And if something's slow to move, it's not really good at hitting other people. And this is where we get into what I think is the most common argument in favor of the Greatsword, and the one that I think I take the most umbrage with. And that is, it is a bodyguard weapon. I'm not going to bother getting into the whole like bullshit idea that you can cut the heads off of pikes with a Greatsword. That's been debunked by a bunch of other people, and hopefully nobody still genuinely believes that. But one thing that I do see people repeat all the time is this bodyguard idea. And the idea, as it's put out in several historical sources, by the way, is that the reason you want that much blade is because now you can get an object moving, with your big swings. And while sure, it's not going to have the same kind of impact or damage as a polearm of equivalent size and weight, what it does have is that it has a cutting surface that goes all the way down to your hands. And that is a kind of advantage. If you think about it this way, if someone's swinging a polearm at your head, the only part that's going to harm you is the pole head. The thing at the top of it, the axe head, the pick head, the hammer head, whatever's at the end of your stick. And if they're swinging at your head and that's the only part that hurts you, one of the things that you can do to make sure that you're not harmed is to get too close. Because if all you get hit by is a big wooden stick, it sucks, but it's not going to kill you like the thing at the end of the stick was going to. But with the Greatsword, that's not the same situation. There is significant amounts of blade that can theoretically harm you all the way from the furthest point of your furthest hand to the tip of the weapon. And that means that the usual tactics of getting past the deadly part of a polearm doesn't work anymore. And there is some merit to this. The idea that you could cut with a Greatsword is pretty valid, obviously, and you could probably do a pretty decent job of cutting with it, even a few inches above your top hand, as opposed to, all the way at the end. You're still going to cut your best all the way at the end of the sword, 100%, but it gives you a lot more leeway, and it explains why I would care to have this much blade presence when, just putting a rock at the end of a stick would do. But the problem is this with this bodyguard idea, is the idea that comes with it and the techniques that get paired with it. Specifically, when these sources talk about bodyguarding, what they really mean is 1 versus X battles. Fights where you are fighting multiple opponents at the same time. And when they talk about bodyguarding, they don't even really seem to imply that it's really good at protecting another person. What it's supposedly good at is protecting one person in the same way that, being able to kill somebody in a duel is protecting yourself. The idea is that the key of the Greatsword is that it's supposed to be this ultimate weapon for fighting multiple opponents. And in my opinion, this is where it falls apart the quickest. And the reason it falls apart so badly is because, as we talked about with the design goals, the Greatsword is pretty clearly designed to be making a giant area where you are going to be swinging and throwing cutting attacks and creating a zone where someone has to deal with your blade in order to enter that zone. Now, the problem here, though, is when we get into the idea of multiple attackers, in order for a spinning blade to be a threat to more than one person, there has to, in some way, be the possibility of striking one person and then still being able to defend yourself or fight a second person. And the thing with swords in general, and pretty much all medieval weapons, is that they're really, really terrible at specifically this. Fighting more than one person, regardless of how much extra range you're getting with the length of your weapon, is really tough because those other people are both able to simultaneously duel you, but also wait until you're a little bit too tied up with one of the other people, thus giving them an ample opportunity to murder you. If you're having a sword fight with another person, like it's Princess Bride, another person can walk up behind you and just hit you with a rock. And there's really not much you can do about it. Because in order to do something about someone who's attacking you, you have to face them, you have to orient your weapon towards them, you have to present a credible threat so that they can't just walk in, and you have to present such a credible threat that they can't just parry it and continue to walk in and get you anyway. And with spinning attacks, this really just doesn't work out. One of the reasons it doesn't work out is specifically because the idea of cutting more than one person is such a fantasy idea. It might not seem like it, but inherently, in order to fight more than one person with these spinning horizontal cuts, the implication here is that if you hit one of them, you won't have your momentum stopped and you'll be able to follow through your cut to meaningfully threaten another person. And this idea sounds remarkably like the idea of cleave. And cleaving is a thing that just flat out doesn't exist. I'm sorry if this is the real bursting of the bubble here, but the idea of taking a sword and cutting through somebody, completely bisecting them, even something as small as their arm, is really, really, really difficult to do. It requires a lot of skill and edge alignment and structure and follow through. And none of that is made possible by spinning like a Beyblade. See, part of the problem here is that every time you want to do one of these flourishes with the Greatsword, you have to reorient the sword. You can't actually just spin around like a top with your arms at full extension. That's not going to work. What's going to happen is that you're going to hit one person and get stopped. Fine. So what they do instead is they throw a cut that's meaningfully edge on during, the cutting portions, and then they pivot out of it so that they can bring the sword back to bear in another preparatory position, at which point they'll be able to drop another cut onto another person. But the problem is that the gap between these two instances is absolutely massive. It takes so much time, even in the theoretical instance where you hit somebody and your sword just went clean through them like a lightsaber. The amount of time it takes for you to slow it down, rechamber, and ready your second cut, and then deliver that second cut is massive. It is so slow, much slower than a long sword, much slower than a regular sword, much slower than anything lighter than it. And it's specifically because of how cumbersome the object is, which means that if you're going to argue that this weapon is really, really good for fighting multiple opponents, why is it so difficult to end an attack and rechamber another attack when that kind of interaction is 100% necessary to fighting more than one person? You can't fight more than one person if you can't meaningfully attack one and then at least defend yourself from another. And that's exactly where the Greatsword starts to fall apart. It's so heavy and it's so wide and it's so thick that when you take these big, heavy swings with the Greatsword, you're essentially using the sword in its worst possible fashion for fighting multiple opponents, because you're relying on the concept of cleave, which, again, basically doesn't exist in reality, to make up for the fact that every single time you make an attack, you make yourself massively open to one of the other attackers to just hit you during your preparation. And that's all without talking about their ability to just simply parry you. Think about it this way. You have a polearm. No one would ever tell you that it was really, really smart to swing around a poleaxe by one end and just say that, oh, anyone who steps into it's going to die. That's not wrong. They probably will die. But it's also not going to cleave through them in like some kind of magical lightsaber. And most importantly, they probably have a weapon too. And while it's certainly true that it's difficult to parry something heavy that's moving fast, it's by no means impossible. See, the thing about swords is that they're levers, just like any stick. And when something's moving very quickly, that's very heavy, its best momentum is towards the end. But if you block something with something that's reinforced on two sides, like a stick, you can cancel out that momentum pretty easily by putting what we would call in HEMA the strong of the blade into the attack. This is why you can sometimes see people fighting crisp and mismatched weapons like sword and buckler and longsword and doing very, very well for themselves, even in the bind. Because the reality is that despite the fact that the longsword is significantly larger, significantly heavier, and has a lot more reach, A regular sword can still parry it so long as they make sure to parry in the right part of their sword. And the same thing is going to be true regardless of whether or not someone's swinging a polearm or a mace or a greatsword at you. If you step forward and you get one good block on that greatsword, you've stopped its momentum dead. It's not going to chop through a piece of wood in one swing. It's not going to chop through a piece of metal in any number of swings, unless your sword breaks. And most importantly, this idea that you're going to be able to fight multiple people with this kind of Beyblade horizontal spinning style seems like it would be very, very easy to stop with just one good parry. The next problem we have with the greatsword, though, is, I think, the most damning. And that is the fact that even if we buy all of the things that go into making the greatsword theoretically good at being a bodyguard weapon, what we're ignoring is all of the other weapons that have design goals that would arguably make it significantly better at that same job. And this is where we start to talk about the spear. As everyone knows from reading memes on the internet, the spear is the ultimate battlefield weapon because it's existed through all cultures and all time periods and all periods of warfare until they got guns, and even then they start naming them spear. So the problem here is that what makes a greatsword a better bodyguard weapon than something like a spear? Spears have reach. They have momentum. They have a little metal thing at the end of a stick that you could theoretically swing around if you really wanted to. But why don't we think of the spear as a good bodyguard weapon? Well, part of it might be that the fact that it doesn't have that much cutting surface, 100% true, but what it does have is a very effective pokey bit at the end of it. And the thing about reach is that poking is way longer than swinging in every case. All the time. If you want to use reach to keep people at bay, why wouldn't you try to stab them rather than swing at them? To which the greatsword people will say, well, the reason is that if I miss with my swing, anybody to the left or right of the person I missed is going to be in danger. But we already kind of know that's bullshit with the ability for people to parry and the fact that if you do fully miss with your swing, you have to bring it around town before the next one comes. But with a spear, you can poke, and then you can pull it back, and you can poke again. And the best part is that spear doesn't weigh very much at all. It can be really, really long and really light, which means it's very bad at cutting for sure. But it means that you can poke, miss, pull back, and poke again. Or poke it at a different person. Or poke at no one at all. Just poke. Poke the air. Poke as much as you want. You're probably not even going to get tired. You're going to pool cue that thing as many times as you feel like, and you can do it to as many people or targets that you like. If you're accurate with a spear, you can get pretty accurate with those pokes too. You can poke people in the face. You can poke around their armor. You can poke them in the foot. You can poke them in the dick. You can poke them wherever. In what world is a spear of equal length to a greatsword a worse bodyguard weapon than a greatsword? Now, I know everyone's already screaming into the comment section, but here's all the examples of people that use greatswords in war. I know they existed. I know they were used in war. But here's the problem. What I'm specifically saying about the greatsword is that it has no specific use case where another would not be better. And again, as a secondary argument, that this whole bodyguard thing is nonsense. If we're talking about very specifically Landsknecht soldiers in Renaissance Germany who were put into pike blocks supposedly for their reason to do something useful, no one's really sure, because some of them say they could chop the heads off of pikes, which is stupid. Some say they could sweep them all off to a side, which is also seems pretty stupid. And specifically that they had these like really, really important use cases, and yet not a single one of them seems to be represented in the design goals of the weapon. Sweeping pikes off to the side doesn't require a giant 7-foot sword. It doesn't require a 7-foot piece of metal. It doesn't even require something to be 7 feet. I could do it with a stick. If I'm trying to kill somebody with it, it needs to be able to deal with the things that they would be wearing and they would be fighting with. It doesn't matter if my greatsword could cleave through 3 peasants, which it can't. It has to be able to cleave through 2 people wearing armor on a battlefield. even if they're lightest of light infantry, they'd still be wearing gambesons. They'd still be impossible to murder more than once. And I still would have zero idea as to why I would be using a greatsword to do it rather than a pick or a axe or a sword or anything else. If I want reach, I have reach. If I want damage, I have damage in polearms. If I want effectiveness against armor, I have more blunt instruments. Every single thing has a use case and a design goal except the greatsword. And so I don't really accept that a lot of these stories about double pay soldiers going to the front of the pike block because they're so brave and so heroic that they could just single-handedly rout a pike formation by spinning like a top. It just seems like utter nonsense. It seems like power fantasy bullshit. It seems like an attempt for the people who, more power to them, managed to find a way to get double pay to keep their importance and to keep their place on the battlefield, regardless of whether or not they actually had one. Because frankly, if you're brave enough to walk into a pike formation, you deserve double pay anyway, and it doesn't matter what weapon you have. But I have a feeling the reason they had those weapons is because that double pay had to go somewhere. And as we already know, a lot of their pay went into looking fancy. My argument is that the greatsword was simply an extension of that fancifulness. It was a role, it was a job, and that job involved being the scariest looking man you could be. So if we think about what the greatsword is best at, we already know. It's best at looking like a huge badass. And just to be clear, looking like a huge badass is extremely important, especially on a battlefield. If you see a guy who looks like he can mess you up, you don't fight him. And it doesn't matter whether or not he could actually mess you up. It doesn't matter if his entire coat is just puffed up SpongeBob anchor arms. It matters that what he looks like is someone who would kill you, so you avoid him. And if all it takes to win a battle is to get a couple dozen people to not want to mess with you, congratulations, you won. No one's going to write down how you're a fraud in history. They're going to write down how a heroic guy in the fanciest dress you've ever seen walked to the front of a pike block with a greatsword and said, "Come at me," and the other group of people went home. That's a cool story. That's a cool person. That's a cool weapon, but it's not a bodyguard weapon. It's not a mass murdering Beyblade of carnage. It's not something that's going to win you a 2v1 fight. Honestly, that's what armor is for. And the worst thing about the greatsword, it's absolutely shit against armor. So if you know any instances of a peasant rebellion that was quelled by a single man in a greatsword, by all means, post it in the comments, in essay length, of course. And make sure to tell me that your personality trait of greatsword is deeply under attack and you're deeply offended. But if you want to see more hot takes like this, because I haven't had a tournament in a couple months, feel free to subscribe. Otherwise, see you next time.